Hi, and welcome to the Luna Knit Along. I'm Ellen Lewis from Crazy For You, and this channel is fun to knit and fabulous to wear. You know that I am normally live on Wednesday nights at this time, but tonight this is a recorded video. It is not live. However, I will be checking the comments, and if you have comments or questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat and I will answer them for you. So this knit along is designed to be a great next sweater for you. If you've never knit a seamed sweater, this is a perfect one because it has simple shaping. It's a dropped shoulder, so the sleeves are easy to sew in. There's no body shaping, and it's all very simple and straightforward. So like I said, it's a great next sweater. The first thing you want to do is get the pattern. I have a link in the description here for this pattern. This is Luna by Quail Studio, and it is just a beautiful, simple design. Let me share it with you. So here it is. I think it's really, really pretty. It is designed in Rowan Felted Tweed Aran. It is clearly designed to be a winter sweater with its yarn, that's that felted tweed, and this cozy cowl neck. But I'm here to tell you that you don't have to do it that way. Me, for instance, I'm going to be knitting this in a cotton yarn, and I'm not probably going to be doing that cowl neck. If I do, I'm going to do it separately. So not only are we going to be looking at this pattern as a knit along to follow the pattern and learn how to make a sweater, we're also going to be talking about some of the things that you can take control of in your knitting. A pattern is a great thing, but you don't have to follow it exactly, okay? It's kind of like a recipe when you're cooking. You can absolutely substitute. If you don't like cilantro, put in parsley, right? If you don't want a cowl neck on this, don't do it. It's super easy to change. And I just want you to feel really empowered when you think about your knitting, because you're the one knitting this and you're going to be the one wearing it, and it has to suit you. So get the pattern and let's get started. The first thing that you're going to want to do is to think about what size you would like to make. That's going to drive all of your decisions about how much yarn to buy to how to follow the pattern. If you're not sure about sizing, look at the video that I did about choosing how to choose a size. I used this pattern in particular to talk about how to choose a size for a drop shouldered sweater. And I'll put a link to that in the description below. So if you haven't already looked at that and you don't already know what size you're going to make, go ahead and do that and think about the size that you want to make and make a decision on that. The next thing that you want to think about is what yarn you're going to use. You could absolutely use the beautiful Felted Tweed Aran. It's a gorgeous yarn, and while I'm not knitting this sweater in it, I probably will knit this sweater again in that yarn because I love it so much and I think it's beautiful. But there are lots of options for other yarns that you can use. As I said, I am making this sweater I'm making a summer version of it. So I'm using a cotton blend yarn that I think will be perfect for it. So if you're thinking about using a different yarn, or you just want to learn more about substituting yarns in a pattern, go ahead and check out the video I did on how to substitute yarn in a pattern, because I did that video with this pattern in mind specifically. And I will put a link to that in the description below. So once you have decided on your size and you have chosen the yarn that you're going to do, you're going to kind of walk through the pattern step by step. So let's do that together. So here is our pattern. And when you look at a pattern for knitting, there's typically a picture of the garment, and ideally there is a schematic. And a schematic is nothing more than a quick sketch of the shape of that garment. So I love a schematic because it tells me the shape, which isn't always clear. You know, if you might look at this line here on the garment and think that that's a set-in sleeve, but it's not. This is a classic drop shoulder with its rectangular body and its trapezoid sleeve that is, sewn right onto the side of the sweater. There's no armhole shaping at all. It also shows you that other than this kind of turtleneck or cowl neck, it's basically just a jewel neck around the front of that. So let's look at the sizes. So this is where you have to make your decision about what size you are going to make. I am going to make this size. So when you have your pattern, go ahead and circle the size that you have decided to make. Circle the size that it's actually going to be when you have completed it. And then you're going to come down here to yarn. Now, if you have chosen to use Rowan Felted Tweed Aran, that is fabulous. And you will know how many skeins of it you need to buy because each of the information pieces in the pattern correlate to the size that you've chosen. So if you're making the smallest size, you know that you will need 13 balls of it. If you're making the second size, you will need the second number. And the third size, you will need the third number, and so forth. So go ahead and circle that as well. As far as choosing the yarn and figuring out how much you need, that's something that I did cover in the video about substituting yarn. So if you are using a different yarn and you need to calculate how many skeins of that different yarn that you need, go ahead and watch that video because it explains it in detail. Okay, so back to our pattern. All right, the next thing that you come to is the needles. Now, the needles that a pattern tells you to use is simply a recommendation. It is not the law. They're telling you what needle size they believe most knitters will need to get their gauge. This is a British pattern, so instead of gauge, they use the word tension, which is completely fine. It means the same thing. Gauge and tension are interchangeable terms, okay? So this one says 16 stitches and 28 rows to 10 centimeters over 4 inches measured over garter stitch using 5mm US 8 needles and 16 stitches and 23 rows to 10 centimeters measured over stocking stitch, also known as stockinette stitch, in the United States using that same size needles. So what they want you to do is they want you to work a gauge swatch in 2 different stitch patterns, okay? Because this garment, the body of it is worked in garter stitch and the sleeves are largely worked in stockinette with garter stitch at the top. So your gauge swatch is going to look something like this. I used my size 8 needles and I cast on 32 stitches and I worked a couple rows in garter stitch and then I began in stockinette and then I worked in garter stitch. So now I can measure that gauge in both of those stitches. I did a very detailed discussion on this in choosing the yarn, so have a look at that video again if you're not clear about doing the gauge and measuring the gauge for this particular pattern. Remember that if you do your gauge swatch and you have more than 16 stitches in 4 inches or 10 centimeters, then you need larger stitches. If more than 16 stitches fit into that space, that means that your stitches are too small and you need a larger needle. If you have fewer than 16 stitches in 4 inches or 10 centimeters, that means your stitches are too big and you need a smaller needle. I think gauge and number of stitches per 4 inches and needle size can be one of the most confusing things for newer knitters. So just remember that if you have too many stitches, then they are too small. And you need larger stitches, and larger needles give you larger stitches. If you have not enough stitches in there, if you have only 15 stitches fit in that space, that means your stitches are too big and you need a smaller needle. So that's a quick way to sort of think about how to adjust your needle size to get the gauge that you want. So if you have not swatched, definitely take the time to swatch. This is so important. I cannot overestimate how important it is to work a gauge swatch, because even a small variance in your gauge will extrapolate into a large variance over the size of your sweater. It could be 2 to 4 inches difference in size, depending on how off you are on your gauge. And, you know, getting that gauge swatch done, I know it seems like a big pain and a waste of time, but trust me when I tell you, you'll be so happy that when you know that you are knitting a size that's going to fit you and that you have the right sized needles. The other thing about gauge and looking at the gauge and the fabric is, if you're trying to make a sweater, and even if you were to say, oh, I don't care if it's a little bit too big or a little bit too small, when the gauge is off, the fabric doesn't really look right, and the garment isn't going to have either the structure that the designer intends or the drape that the designer intends. So that gauge is important not only for the size, but also for the fabric that you're creating. So as much of a pain as it is, and as much as you want to go ahead and get started right away, please take the time to work a gauge swatch until you find the needle that is going to give you the correct gauge. I get a lot of questions too about whether you should wash your gauge swatch or not. I personally do not feel the need to wash my gauge swatch. This is a seamed sweater, and sometimes, you know, washing a swatch can cause it to stretch out a little bit or whatever. What I like to do is to block my swatch. I like to pin my swatch to the size that it is supposed to be. You know, given that I'm using the needle that that gives me the gauge, I like to pin my swatch to the size and shape that it's supposed to be and then block it, which is going to give the fabric an opportunity to relax if it's going to do that, but it's not going to allow, say, a superwash to kind of stretch out and get super floppy. That is just my opinion, okay? There are millions of people who would tell you that you need to wash and dry your swatch. You do you, okay? I'm just telling you how I do it, okay? So I like to block my swatch. So let's move on. Okay, the other things that it's going to do, the pattern is going to tell you what other things you need to have handy. They want you to have stitch markers and they want you to have stitch holders. When a pattern tells me to have stitch markers, I usually think in terms of the stitch markers that are ring markers that live on my needle. But I can tell you that when you have a dropped shouldered sweater, they typically want you to have stitch markers that are removable. It doesn't hurt to have both handy, but you will certainly want to have removable stitch markers here for marking where your armhole begins. You will also want stitch holders because you'll be putting a portion of your fabric on hold while you are working the other side. This happens in the shoulder. Okay, so traditionally a sweater is begun by working the back. I'm not sure why they have you working the front first on this, but let's just go with it. So let's sort of walk through the pattern, circling the stitch information that relates to the size that you are going to make. So if I'm making the third size, I'm going to circle the third size everywhere there are numbers in parentheses. Okay, so take the time to go ahead and circle your correct number of stitches for your size as you go through the pattern. So basically this says cast on. It has you work in ribbing for 1 1/4 inches and then working straight and continuing in garter stitch. Then it has you work your neck, shaping your shoulders. Then it has you go to your back. That's super easy, right? It has you do your back exactly the same as your front. A little different measure there, and shaping your shoulders, and then you are putting your shoulder stitches on a stitch holder. And then they have you come to your sleeves, right? So they're going to have you cast on for your sleeves. You're going to circle the number of stitches that you'll be casting on, So they have you working in ribbing, and then they have you working in stockinette and working all through that. And then they tell you about making up, which is what we call finishing or seaming. And they're not giving you very much information about the mattress stitch, but we will definitely go over this in our knit along. And then they have you work the neckband. And there is the beautiful pattern. Okay, so I think this is a beautiful pattern. I love it. There are a couple things that I am going to do differently. You absolutely need to feel free to knit this pattern exactly as directed. The changes that I am going to make are as follows. First of all, the back and the front, they have you start with ribbing. Okay, traditionally, ribbing is used to hold stockinette fabric straight, and garter stitch is not stockinette fabric. So stockinette fabric curls, and you need that ribbing on there to hold it straight. I personally am going to start straight off with my garter stitch because I like the look of a garter stitch edge. I am going to go ahead and start my fabric with garter stitch, and I'm just going to not have a ribbing on there at all. If you want a ribbing, you do you, okay? That's just what I am going to do. Because I am doing garter stitch from the get-go, 1.5 inches, I'm replacing that 1.5 inches of ribbing with garter stitch. You know that garter stitch, it doesn't roll, but it does have a tendency to flare out. So what I am going to do is I am going to use a smaller needle. I'm going to use a needle 2 sizes smaller than what I use to get gauge on this fabric to work 1.5 inches of my garter stitch. And that should hold the bottom of my fabric a little bit firmer and a little bit closer. It's not going to roll, it's not going to pull in, but it is not going to flare out. So that's something that I am going to do differently. The other adjustment that I am going to make is because I'm not doing the ribbing, I'm not going to cast on the number of stitches that they call for, because if you look at the pattern, it has you cast on a certain number of stitches and work in knit 2, purl 2 ribbing. And a knit 2, purl 2 ribbing, when you're working a sweater, it needs to be a multiple of 4 plus 2, and they have given you that number. And then after you've finished your ribbing, they ask you to increase 2 stitches. So the number of stitches that they want you to have for the body is actually the number of stitches that they tell you to cast on plus 2. So if you are doing the ribbing, go ahead and do it exactly as the pattern tells you. If you are not doing the ribbing, if you're going straight into the garter stitch, then go ahead and cast on the number of stitches that they tell you to have after the ribbing is complete. And I'm not trying to confuse you. I just want you to understand that all of these things are things that you can change. If you don't like the idea of the ribbing on that sweater, you don't have to do it. It is entirely up to you. For me, for this sweater, what I am doing is I am going to cast on the number of stitches that appear in the section after the ribbing, and I am going to work those stitches for 1.25 inches on a needle 2 sizes smaller than the one I used to get gauge. Okay, and then we'll just move on from there. So after that 1.25 inches, garter stitch on the smaller needle, we're going to switch to a larger needle, and we are going to continue up as the pattern indicates to where the armhole is going to begin. Okay, so after this section here, where I talk about how I'm going to do it, which is different from the pattern, you're just continuing straight. You're just working in garter stitch straight up until the fabric is however long it says it should be for your size, okay? And then you are going to mark that with your locking stitch marker. So you're going to take a stitch marker and you are going to put it at each end of your fabric into that stitch so that you know this is where your armhole begins. And then you're going to continue in garter stitch until it is long enough to be this size for your armhole. Okay, so again, circle the size that's right for you. And that, my friends, should take us through at least a week. And then I will make another video, and it won't be live, it will be recorded just like this. And we will talk about working that neck. Again, I'm going to make some changes around the neck because of the way I like to do things, and I